Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Monday, May 20th, 2024, and today we're going to be talking about the Wisconsin Senate race, a very important one that's upcoming this coming November, in which Democrats and Republicans are really vying to maintain control in this state, whether that comes down to the Senate level, the House level, the presidential level. We are seeing Republicans and Democrats really scramble to win on every single, bit of competitiveness in this battleground state, alongside many others. And it comes at a unique point because Wisconsin is a state that was won by Joe Biden in the last presidential election by 0.6%. It just so happens to be a state that Donald Trump won in the 2016 election by 0.7%. And so Wisconsin is arguably one of the closest states on the presidential level. It was the third closest state of the 2020 presidential election, and it has a very important Senate race that very much does not differentiate too heavily from the presidential in its national impacts. What happens in Wisconsin will likely happen on the national level. Whoever's winning there in the presidential election probably is winning the presidency, and the polls have been fluctuating back and forth for Democrats and Republicans, but now the Senate race is what we're focusing on today. And that's because the Republican presumptive nominee here, the GOP frontrunner, who is endorsed by President Trump, Eric Hovey, who is starting out from a very strong position in the Wisconsin GOP primary, is starting out in a very weak position this coming November general election. Wisconsin is a state that, number one, at baseline, is not super sympathetic to Republicans on the statewide level. We've seen in recent elections, like the governor's race in 2022, that Wisconsin was very open to re-electing Tony Evers, despite his approval rating, as a Democratic incumbent, not being super high. Equally, too, you can see that in the 2020 presidential election, Donald Trump lost the state to Joe Biden, but 2018 was an even more spectacular feat for Democrats, in which Tammy Baldwin defeated Leah Vukmir by a margin of roughly 11 points. The governor's race also flipped blue. Now, Wisconsin has elected Republicans as recently as 2022. Senator Ron Johnson, when he ran for re-election, was able to win in the state of Wisconsin, and it was arguably, a closer race than it actually should have been. But overall, we can look at this and say, this was a good result for the Republican Party. But it seems to be really the only good result that we've seen over the past couple of years in this battleground state. Democrats keep winning in other statewide elections, not only the governorship, but also the Supreme Court elections in terms of liberal or conservative ideology. Democrats seem to be steamrolling Republicans when it comes down to backing liberal justices. And now the Wisconsin Supreme Court actually has an ideological lean towards Democrats. And there's a reason for that. But in this Senate race, I think we're looking at this from the lens that Wisconsin could be a much closer Senate race than what people have been expecting for quite some time. Right now, with Tammy Baldwin running for re-election, she has served in this position for quite some time when it comes down to Senate races. You can see that back in 2006, that's when we saw the Democrats win here by 37.8. 6 years later, this is a state where Paul Ryan is from. The Republican nominee for vice president is on the ballot here. Barack Obama seeing decreases in support across a number of states. And so Wisconsin came in as a unique state on the battleground spectrum. But it ultimately went to Tammy Baldwin by 5.5% in 2012. 6 years later, 2 years after Donald Trump won the state in 2016, Tammy Baldwin wins by 10.8%. A state that was won by Trump 2 years prior, now going to the Democratic Party by roughly 11 points. And so you have to ask, why is that? Well, it has to do with the fact that Tammy Baldwin is popular, but not popular enough that it would say that she could ignore any type of wave that would happen on the presidential level. If Donald Trump really was to steamroll Joe Biden and win in all the battleground states by excessive margins, chances are the Senate race would be competitive as well. But that hasn't been the case for quite some time. The polling numbers show that Tammy Baldwin leads by roughly 7 points on average in this state. Even the New York Times and Siena College poll that showed Trump ahead by 1 point shows Tammy Baldwin ahead by 7, roughly an 8-point swing. On average, Tammy Baldwin leads by 7. You see on average here, Trump leads by 1. Again, an 8-point swing on average. And it's really interesting too, because Republicans seem to be losing in this state, not because just Tammy Baldwin being a strong candidate, but also because Republicans have just simply not nominated the best possible people for this race. For instance, when Eric Hovey first spoke about the 2020 presidential election and doubled down on it when pressed about it by the media, he pretty much, questioned the mental capacity of nursing home residents to vote. Now, if you know anything about American politics, it is that older voters are the most likely to vote Republican out of any age group. As you get older, you become more conservative and more likely to back the Republican nominee for Senate, House, President, whatever it might be. And so when you make comments like these as what would be the presumptive Republican nominee and who he is going to be the Republican nominee, barring any type of major intervention by a major candidate in the Senate race here, comments like these really only serve to turn off your base. And it isn't just comments like these that have been really making Eric Hovey a difficult nominee to rally behind on the Republican side. It's also the fact that he's from outside of the state. He's being largely seen as a carpetbagger. He's facing questions with a California lawsuit because that's the state he hails from. I mean, you have a lot of things that are at play here, but I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that Republicans have chosen somebody who they at one point in time thought would be the strongest potential contender against somebody like Tammy Baldwin, a political outsider who has no electoral experience, who does not come into this as a standard U.S. representative or state senator or state representative or whoever it might be. Someone who has an electoral track record, which I think Republicans were really trying to shy away from, against Tammy Baldwin, who has served in the United States Senate for quite some time. And I think they're actually starting to see the direct repercussions of making decisions like this one. Because it is the Republican Party that has consistently, for the past 3 election cycles, nominated poor candidates when it comes down to who they are in terms of quality, who they are in terms of ability to win elections. I mean, electoral track record has never been a major consideration. Fundraising record has never been a major consideration because Republicans are constantly looking for their mini Donald Trumps. They're political outsiders who could come into this race and really shock the state. But it has only happened once, and that was with Donald Trump in the 2016 election, and since then, Republicans have been losing. And this time around, it really isn't any different. You can see it in the polls that Eric Hovey is losing, but most recently now, another scandal to add into the mix here with a history of invoking anti-Semitic slurs now being uncovered. An exclusive article here that is covering Eric Hovey, who is going to likely again win this August GOP nomination. But all of this baggage is starting to come up, and all of this baggage is absolutely going to matter. It also has to do with the fact that, again, today now, we see that Eric Hovey, this was reported on today, we find that he believes that a 12 to 14 week abortion ban is probably a reasonable time range. In a time at which abortion is something that Republicans simply cannot message on correctly, that they need desperately in order to be ignored for them to win elections like this one, you do not have your candidates going out there and saying there is at all a reasonable time range when it comes down to the issue of abortion. Regardless of how you personally feel or not, taking stances like this one are really only going to hurt you, and any simple research can show that in a state like Wisconsin, you find that 60% of Wisconsinites, on average, have supported abortion being legal in all or most cases. And this is done by Marquette University, Marquette Law School. They do a slew of polls in Wisconsin, and they're quite accurate, more often than not. And for them to find that the overwhelming majority, I mean, this is not a 51-49 scenario, this is 60%, sometimes plus, of Wisconsin voters here that believe that abortion should be legal or all cases. In their latest poll, too, you saw in 2022, September of 2022, 68% said it should be legal in all or most cases. And so this is really where I call into question the PR team of Eric Hovey, the communications team, who is briefing him on the things that he says, and who did the vet? Right? When Donald Trump endorsed him, when national Republicans endorsed him, when statewide elected Republicans endorsed him, I mean, where was the vet for this guy? Because a lot of the things that we're seeing, the comments he makes about older voters, the California lawsuit, the anti-Semitic comments, the, statements now on abortion, who went through this vet and said, this is the right guy for U.S. Senate? Because while the bench wasn't super extensive, there are 5 sitting representatives from the state of Wisconsin. In fact, I think 6 sitting Republican representatives from the state of Wisconsin that were elected back in 2022. I mean, you had a considerable portion of the electorate here that could have reasonably decided, I'm going to take a step back from my safe Republican seat and make the safe Democratic seat less safe, more competitive, and potentially winnable. But instead, they all backed down. And I think a lot of them backed down because they didn't want to lose against Tammy Baldwin, which is fair. But equally, it's a problem because the person that they either had to settle for or who they proposed up, whatever it might be, because I wasn't there in the conversations in the rooms where they made this decision, but it is clear that this was the wrong choice for the Wisconsin GOP. But it is far too late to do some type of course reversal. They have to stick with what they have, but it just simply is not pretty and will not be this coming November. When Tim Michels came out in support of an abortion ban, with the exceptions of rape and incest, it became a problem in Wisconsin. Tim Michels was leading in the polls. He was leading the chances at winning the governor's race. He was expected to do quite well against Tony Evers. In fact, based on Tony Evers' popularity rating, based on his electoral history, Tim Michels practically had this governor's race in the bag. Until he didn't. On election night, the voters in Wisconsin re-elected their Democratic governor not by a narrow margin, but instead by nearly 4 points. This was a state that was supposed to be a near Republican flip by 5 to 6 points. I mean, we were looking at polls here that showed Tim Michels up by a considerable amount, but also Ron Johnson, the Republican senator, was outperforming him by 5-6 points. And so everyone's standard understanding was that there's no way that you see this ticket splitting. And in a way, they were right? Ron Johnson ended up performing significantly less than a 6-point advantage, but that's because Tony Evers brought that support to people down the ballot, brought the support to his Lieutenant Governor Mantella Barnes. I mean, you were looking at a Wisconsin governor's race here where Tony Evers was actually translating to down-ballot victories for Democrats, down-ballot improvements for Democrats in the Senate race and other races across the state. But it's so interesting to see because Tim Michels took a very unpopular stance in a state that very clearly stands for the issue of abortion and for it to be legal in all or most cases. And yet it resulted in a loss because that's how these things work. When you take stances, when you make claims, when you are embroiled in scandals, voters reject you multiple times, and they reject you pretty much at the ballot box in a very, very clear manner. I mean, we rarely ever see when it comes down to many of these races here that, Democrats and Republicans are immune to scandal, are immune to candidate quality. In fact, most recently, though it has been negatively impacting Republicans, it was in full force in the 2022 midterms. We saw it with Dr. Oz and Herschel Walker and Blake Masters. Very winnable races that should have been won in any other type of year with any other type of candidate, but ultimately was not because Republicans failed to choose the right people. The same thing is happening now. We already have Wisconsin as a likely blue state. But the more and more that I hear about Eric Hovey, the less that I think this race is actually going to be this competitive. While I do think in terms of margin, this is likely where it will reside, ultimately speaking, Tammy Baldwin will probably have a 99% chance at victory should this trend continue. Because more and more opposition research is being dug up. More and more information is being sourced by the Wisconsin Democratic Party. And so what they are doing here is they are finding things here to popularize around Eric Hovey so people know that he's done this before they decide to vote for him. And it has very clearly been effective. It's a strategy that Democrats also employed in 2022 when it came down to a lot of these races. In fact, we're seeing it even in the 2024 election cycle when it comes down to the North Carolina governor's race. This is a race that Democrats are really hoping they can win. And Mark Robinson, he was someone who a lot of these scandals did actually arise, but he was elected to the lieutenant governor because nobody cared about this race. I mean, it was very interesting to see. But he was able to really ignore a lot of the things that now matter for his gubernatorial race because he was running for a lesser position. This time around, what Democrats decided to do was allow Mark Robinson to win the nomination with endorsements from many prominent Republicans across the state, win endorsements from Donald Trump, Senator Ted Budd, Representative Dan Bishop. I mean, you were talking about Mark Robinson steamrolling this nomination process. And the day after the nomination, the Democratic Party of North Carolina releases a lot of opposition research. And now Mark Robinson, pre-primary polling, was actually doing quite well. We can see here, if we can find the polls, pre-primary polling was doing quite well. And now most recently, Josh Stein has started to increase his advantage. 2 points, 2 points, 3 points, 8 points, 9 points, losing in some. But a much better track record for the Democratic Party, and that's because they waited on a lot of the information they are holding back on. The same thing is likely happening in the state of Wisconsin. The things that do leak to the press, and the things that the press discover on their own is one problem. But another problem for this too is that Democrats, quite frankly, just do not seem to be worried about the Wisconsin Senate race at all. And based on the things that we're seeing come out, based on the things that we're starting to learn about the Republican presumptive nominee here, I don't think Democrats should be that worried either. Wisconsin is a state that likes Tammy Baldwin. And regardless of where Joe Biden is, I do believe that it is going to re-elect her to the United States Senate. The question is, too, does she have enough to carry Joe Biden across the finish line? Today, Donald Trump leads by 0.6. Feels very similar to the 2022 midterms when we saw that Tim Michels was leading, by roughly a similar amount, by 1 to 2 points statewide. He ultimately ended up losing by 3 to 4 points statewide, but he was still up on election night. And so at that point in time, I guess now reflecting on that, I really call into question, are these polling averages correct? Is this just another repeat of 2022 where we said, Republicans are going to win, but they actually end up not winning? And I think that maybe could be determined by how much enthusiasm we see for candidates like Tammy Baldwin. When voters are voting for one candidate for one thing, they're likely to vote for that party through and through. I mean, 90% of the ballots pretty much only fill out one singular, political party, regardless of what the race is. It doesn't matter if it's county commissioner or whether it comes down to Secretary of State or senator or representative or president. It is almost always a singular political party through every single section of the ballot. But that 10% is what matters. And that 10% clearly is choosing Tammy Baldwin significantly more than they are choosing Eric Hovey. And I think a lot of it has to do with his own fault. These scandals that are popularizing, these problems that he is facing in his campaign, a lot of it has to do with the things he has said in the past, the things he has done in the past, and the way he approaches it today. He doubles down on some of the comments that he shouldn't double down on. He makes comments that he shouldn't. He presents himself in a way that he shouldn't. And a lot of it comes across either as disingenuous, tone deaf, somebody who just simply doesn't understand Wisconsin politics, and that is his fundamental problem. Wisconsin is at a point where very clearly they are willing to split their vote from Joe Biden and vote for Trump, but for Democrats down the ballot and in the U.S. Senate race. And that's a very positive thing for Democrats in the Senate because it means that even if Donald Trump is taking away support from Joe Biden, it isn't translating to Republican support in Senate or potentially other congressional elections, which while that may not be the best scenario for Democrats, it certainly is a lot more optimal and, a lot better for them than losing the Senate race in Wisconsin alongside losing the presidential. And so we'll see as more and more things start to release as Eric Hovey puts the Republican Party on the wrong track for this election, but I think it's far too late to course correct. They're just going to have to ride it out. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch and a playlist for my 2024 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.